So welcome to the Blue Swan. Today we are honored to have Emmy and Webby award-winning showrunner and content creator Stephan Vladimir Bugaj. And did you want to introduce us and mention anything about your achievements or interests?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I've been, won the Emmy Award for our Silent Hill Ascension project, which was a interactive TV show and web and mobile gaming hybrid format that we created, where the entire audience changes the outcome of the story, both by participating in the game and through directly, like participating in story choices, like you would in like a Telltale game or Bandersnatch. Um, and my recent interest has pivoted a lot towards being able to do generative AI storytelling, not like the story itself, but the visuals, the sound, and so on, the production, which was inspired a lot by how expensive it is to produce multiple threads of branching narrative in those kinds of interactive stories, and trying to be able to produce those at a cost where that format can be profitable again. So I recently just put out um, a short film, all Gen AI visuals, mostly Gen AI dialogue, except for the two main characters or two of the three main characters, um, called The Seeker, which is available on the genvid.com website, as is the filmmaking tool for Gen AI filmmakers that I designed while and built with Jerry, my colleague, while making The Seeker, that enables anyone who wants a professional style filmmaking workflow for Gen AI filmmaking to have that. So that's what I've been up to.
Cool. And so during one of your panels, you mentioned some of the features for GenVid, where different variations of the same content will be produced in parallel. And so there may be six different versions of a similar media asset produced as an output. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how that affects circular content creation and how that changes from what was initially a linear media format where you would go from script to production and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, it can change in a lot of really interesting ways. I mean, anyone who's done enough content creation, whether it's film and TV or like various cinematic games, knows that like when you're developing a story, something that's narrative heavy, there's a lot of iteration. And the more that you can bring together the iteration of like the visuals and the script and the dialogue delivery and so on, into a tight loop, the more effectively and efficiently you can iterate. So like, on a live action set, you have to do a reshoot. So you've got to reset up everything and restage all of the actors. And if you want to make changes, you might have to physically move blocking around and set dressing and so on, depending, or you had to design for all those up in advance. Then you get to CG, where you've already got your CG stuff built, but it's like a live action set where you don't want to overbuild because it's expensive. And so you're still taking a similar approach, but it's a little tighter, faster loop because you don't have to like physically move things around and have hours for an entire crew and so on. When you get into Gen AI, the way I made the Seeker was I originally wrote a different script, started trying to make it, realized that Gen AI technology wasn't ready to give me the results I wanted for that film. So instead, I did a visual exploration where I created what became the scene of the Seeker and a green alien character having a conversation in a cafe aboard a space station. I built that in the Gen AI tool, and then I wrote a dialogue script for that. I cut it together with AI voice dialogue and watched it, and I was like, yeah, that's credible. I would like to make this movie. And then I wrote the entire script and started making it. And that was a very tight, inexpensive loop where I was able to get what became ultimately final footage. Whereas if I had done that in previs for CG or previs CG of live action, or had done a like a test shoot on a location that then might need to change, or a not fully built set, um, in addition to all of the additional expenses of making those media, those aren't potentially final footage. So it really tightens the loop, and it's very inexpensive. Like I tell a lot of indie filmmakers, Like now is the time with these generation credits being pretty expensive to go and make the films you've always wanted. If you're willing to do them in Gen AI, because I made The Seeker, which is 22 to 24 minutes, um, entirely end to end, all of visuals cost $2,000 worth of generation credits. And if I had tried to do that live action, I probably would have paid more than $2,000 just for one of the spacesuits. So it's a big game changer for independent filmmaking, I believe.
Oh, on cost efficiency, absolutely.
Yeah,
And
sure.
and so a lot of actors and some producers talk about how AI generated content lacks somewhat of the human touch. And so you've mentioned in your panels that there are some nuances that the AI still isn't quite perfect with. You know, there are 70 different ways for an actor to cry, and it can't quite mimic, you know, the breathing and everything else and lip movements, which is why helmets might be used in production. And so, how do you think that's going to change the definition of art? And what do you think is going to happen to indie filmmaking as a result when different forms of IP that were used in production can now be rolled back and forth, you know, from scripts to images and images to videos, you know,
Uh,
etc.
Yeah, I mean, so to dovetail that with finishing answering your previous question, the tight iteration loop lets you try new things very quickly and inexpensively. And that allows you to iteratively develop. And I think that's one of the things that's going to change is it allows a lot of iterative development, which if you know what you're doing is fantastic. And if you don't, you can go down rabbit holes and become incoherent and so on. Um, there are a lot of things that the Gen AI can't do yet in terms of performances. The facial expression and lip sync is getting better, and I think a lot of things will continue to get better. Um, but the fact of the matter is, like, it's an inexpensive way to make a movie. So you're going to start with, or I'm going to start with low budget filmmaking. And I look at what can be done now, whether you've got helmets on, like I do in The Seeker, or like they did in a lot of the characters in Remo Green, or a lot of the characters in Echo Hunter 1, where they then took them off in Echo Hunter 2. Um, or you're showing faces like a lot of Echo Hunter 2 and so on. I'm comparing what we're doing now both to the early days of CG, where if you go back to the really early days of like Andre and Wally B and stuff like that, it's a lot better. And also to lower budget filmmaking like Roger Corman and Golan and Globus and stuff that I grew up with in the 80s. And the comparison is not bad. Like the acting quality of a Gen AI character versus the quality of actor that you can get when you don't have a big budget and you don't aren't necessarily like tied into this theater scene or you're trying to do genre stuff where the top end actors don't want to do low budget genre even if they're like up and coming. Like it compares pretty favorably and allows you to do a lot of interesting things. I still think people will want to use traditional CG, hand-drawn animation, cameras, both digital and film, for different kinds of expression. Just like when CG became very prominent, there are still people who just want to shoot on 35, who want to do their effects practically. But I think the bulk of like mainstream, um, cost controlled sort of proletarian filmmaking and to some extent game making and so on is going to involve a lot more AI because it's cheap and fast and it lets you iterate a lot and you can explore things. The control needs to get better. The prompt adherence needs to get better. Its ability to understand filmmaking language needs to get better. The acting needs to get better. Um, the script writing really, really needs to get better. Um, but as a tool for a human, like I'm not even that interested other than as like sort of a research consideration in just having an AI make a film entirely by itself. I personally believe if AI has become capable of doing that on their own, they'll make films for other AIs because that's their experience. They don't have a human experience. But as a tool for a human filmmaker to express things that they might not otherwise get the budget for, or in the case of some people, like a friend sent me a feature film made by a guy in Malaysia that talks about LGBTQ issues and domestic violence issues, which would never get approved by the censors in Malaysia. So like he could just go make his movie. And it exists. There's a Malay language film that this guy made that deals with these topics that's real today. And I think like things that wouldn't get past censors, things that you couldn't get the budgets for, ideas that are experimental. I think it's a great tool for that, and it opens up a lot of possibilities other than being one of the 40,000 scripts that gets thrown into the Hollywood system each year, a handful of which get made.
No, I imagine it's easy for a lot of scripts to just get lost in the system. And so, like, well, it's still possible to just directly tell an LLM, like, you are George Lucas, try and produce something like him. There's like a light and a dark side to AI generated production. And so some of that ranges from anything from, pornography generated from Taylor Swift images, which is enough to drive her agents and legal team completely nuts, to deep fakes and whatnot. And then on the light side, the interaction with the audience has become a lot more direct, and the effects of social media on content creation and the data that can be streamed back and forth has a profound impact on audience engagement. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on everything from, potential safety regulations to the evolution of content formats, from generative AI, ranging from verticals to anything else.
Absolutely. So I'll start with the first half, which is I believe strongly that guardrails, governance, and accountability are essential for all uses of AI. And the more the industry avoids those in the name of speed and profitability, the more trouble they're causing for all of us down the line. Um, I think that Taylor Swift's lawyers have every right to go after every person who uses her image unauthorized, especially if they're making things that are unacceptable and essentially are a form of digital sexual assault. Um, the Disney deal with OpenAI, I believe, like I don't know the people who were involved in writing the deal, but like I believe it had a lot to do with giving Disney both control and a revenue stream from the user-generated content that users are going to just go ahead and do in Sora and allowing them to put control and accountability on the Sora use of their characters. Um, so I think there's going to be a lot of very fast evolution in terms of both legal and commercial contracts around IP protections, likeness rights protections, and so on. But I think that in general, um, guardrails, guidelines, guardrails, governance, and accountability are essential, and that's going to involve regulations like we're seeing emerge in India in particular and Europe, and basically creating a playing field in which um, the people who want to do things like create unauthorized pornography and stuff are going to be out of the mainstream market, and the mainstream players are going to have protections against all that stuff. And since those mainstream players are going to be the largest and most capable, that will hamper a lot of the ability of people to be bad actors. Although with things like DeepSeek, we're also seeing this is starting to filter down into desktop capable um, for some of, I think what we're seeing in LLMs is eventually going to come to some extent in diffusion models and so on. Although there's a whole top end discussion about hardware, that's a whole other thing. So I think the governance and accountability issues and safety issues are crucial. And even more so when you get into stuff that we're not talking about, like AI as therapists and companions and stuff, which is all in the news. Um, and then like in terms of how I see it changing formats and so on. I mean, I think there's a lot of possibility there. So like the Emmy Award that I won with my colleagues was for developing a new format. And I think that with Gen AI, there's a bunch of possibilities for a few things. One is just sort of looking traditionally at how it can make it possible for indies to develop more of a franchise and have more of an ongoing social and community relationship with their audience, which I believe is essential for success now. And you can see that with things like at the high end, the way that people rally around K-pop Demon Hunters, or at the indie end, like the very well curated and managed Cult of the Lamb multi-transmedia experience where you've got the game and the shorts and the raves and all this sort of thing. And I think Gen AI makes it possible to create a lot more of that content more cost effectively. So if you're making something like a Cult of the Lamb or something like a glitch production style animated show, it makes it cheaper and faster for you to be able to also do things like have shorts and comic books and backdrops for live events and game content and so on, than it ever was before. And it's already pretty easy to do some of that stuff with things like Blender and Roblox and stuff like that. So you're already seeing this social general franchise building approach where the creators are taking charge of things that used to maybe be licensing, and especially for indies, it's just a better deal for them to do that themselves. But then I think also there's new formats that will come out of this, which are going to be things that are responsive to user inputs and with breadth and depth that we've not been able to do before, um, and things that can deepen and expand the consequences of choices that players make in interactive experiences that can allow creators to engage with the social of their franchise and create new linear experiences very quickly that respond to what people are talking about like that week, which is something we did live action with our Rival Peak project. And boy, let me tell you, that was something to write a script on Friday and have it on air on Wednesday, doing a live action shoot with, 50 people that you have to manage. Now being able to do that with Gen AI at your desktop, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to do a lot of reactive, responsive, engaging content by allowing the audience to participate in various ways, whether it's directly or indirectly. And as long as the creators are doing that in a way that's engaged and authentic, then how the pixels are made ultimately is not what the audience is most concerned about. They're most concerned about being able to have the experience with the IP that they've come to love that they want.
Yeah, some people, have joked about how the deal between Disney and OpenAI was essentially, writing a contract with Hannibal Lecter. So the media companies aren't being consumed by a lot of these VC-backed AI giants. And, you know, when you look at some of the visuals from the Silent Hill series, like there's a lot of similarity towards, game assets that might be generated in Unreal or Houdini. And so in terms of the generation of content and the pixelation behind that content and the way that the algorithms, process said media, there's a lot of potential variance between the video content that's being pumped out and then potential game content, and then sort of the mathematics and the probabilistic outcomes in terms of real-time engagement within game content can change as it's being played. And so as the creator audience interaction becomes more and more dynamic and things are easier to both track and change in terms of real-time engagement, how do you think that that's going to affect the gaming ecosystem? And what kinds of developers do you think are going to excel at that?
For sure. So Silent Hill Ascension, for example, that was done the traditional way. Like the cinematics were all done by a team in Argentina called Senscape. It was done in Unreal Engine. Um, and our successor project, DC Heroes United, was all done in Blender in a traditional way. And so, like, our direct experience is that, um, and this is true of all the stuff I worked on at Telltale. I know people at other companies through the industry, and making this kind of branching narrative content is expensive. So for us, bringing down the cost using Gen AI may make it cost effective for this particular type of interactive experience to be available because it's been very hard to make it for inexpensively enough that it fits the size of the market of people who want that kind of content, which used to be more possible um, during the heyday of Telltale, but people's expectations have grown since the heyday of Telltale. So you've got an audience that has bigger expectations, but it's not a huge audience. So being able to make something that's right sized for that audience is a great opportunity for people who love that medium. In terms of interactive in general, I mean, I think that there's two things. One is there's the cost control aspect, which um, like you're going to have two vectors there. One is um, large studios aren't necessarily going to want to bring down um, their costs too low. They're going to want to bring them down somewhat because they're kind of out of control. But they're still going to have large teams making content. And as the Gen AI gets better, they're just going to use it to make bigger and more engaging experiences for their audiences. And then indies are going to be able to make things at scales they weren't able to before. But in terms of new experiences, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for real time and near real time and deeply pre-branched experiences because of the abilities of Gen AI both to create content quickly at a lower cost and also because you can use the analytical aspects of AI to do things like profile how a player is interacting with the experience and change it to give them more of what they want, the things they like, the challenges they are enjoy overcoming, more of the characters that they prefer interacting with, more of the plot that they've found the most engaging by looking at their behavior and doing behavioral analysis and adapting based on that. And so like I think the kinds of teams that are going to embrace this are ones that um, are willing to look at what AI can do for them that allows their human artists to create things that connect with their players more deeply and more engagingly and deploy the AI in that way versus the ones who are just like, how many people can I fire by making this stuff as cheap as possible? Because that kind of like low, like make it as cheap as possible. There's already ways to make things as cheap as possible. And when you make things as cheap as possible, they're not necessarily good. So there's a balancing point where if you actually are not trying to be shovelware, and there's shovelware now, right? Like it's not like that's a rare thing because of the lack of AI. Um, like shovelware is going to continue to be shovelware, and it's continue to just pile up on the floor. Now with AI, there'll be more of it. The pile will be bigger, um, and it's going to create more problems for discoverability, which is something that like analytical AI can help with, can help overcome the problem Gen AI is going to create. Because the pile is going to be bigger, it's going to make it hard to be discovered, but it's not like people who are incompetent at making games are suddenly going to be competent at making games because of Gen AI.
No, and so even back in the old days of Xbox One, there were still, variations in gameplay where people could, press a couple of buttons and then the storyline and the direction of the game would change, slightly. It's definitely not it's not as dynamic. It's not entirely in real time, but it's been computationally designed for a while. Um, and so what about the use of more characters in terms of AI actresses like Tilly Norwood? And that spiked up a storm, months ago, and apparently there are, 40 more like her now. And so, what do you think that degree of detail is going to do to storylines, both within films and within games?
So there's a couple of things. So first of all, I think Tilly Norwood created the stir that she did because of how she looks and what she is and what that says about our society and a lot of things. Um, there's 40 more now. Why not 400? Like, I mean, like just numbers is not that interesting, right? So like it's not like once you've created one of these to the level that it is, and the other analysis I have of Tilly Norwood today is where is this big onslaught of Tilly Norwood content that's capturing the minds and imaginations of audiences? I have not seen any. Um, so more of nothing seems like more of nothing. Um, but in terms of how the idea behind Tilly Norwood can change things. So in terms of film and TV, in terms of any kind of content, people still want to have a relationship with other people. They're gonna want other people behind it. In a lot of film and TV type content, they're gonna want actors they like, whether that's established actors or new actors that are coming up. Um, but the synthetic actors, the future Tilly Norwoods, or even the characters I created ad hoc myself in Seeker, or that Cavan did in Echo Hunter, or and so on. Um, like that allows indies to be able to create stuff that doesn't require all of the framework and expense and dealing with agents and all that sort of stuff that live action filmmaking requires, or that you need for voice acting for like a premium CG production. Um, in terms of the higher end, you can imagine that a lot of VFX houses should be digging into Gen AI right now, both for traditional explosions and things like that. Although right now that's a lot more controllable in something like a fluid sim. Um, but it's getting there in Gen AI, but also background characters, right? If you don't have to model and rig legions of stormtroopers, for example, that's a viable, valuable cost savings. In terms of games, so there is a push for AI NPCs, but to an extent, it has been a solution in search of a problem. Because again, a lot of something is not interesting. There's a lot of NPCs you can talk to in this game. Like, great. Why? Like designing to using that resource in a way that's interesting and engaging for the human players is a tool and an opportunity for game designers to embrace and to build something off of. But just having that capability isn't enough. I mean, InWorld built a business around that and just pivoted. InWorld is no longer built entirely around providing these AI NPCs as their business line because it didn't work. It wasn't what people were clamoring for. Um, but I think that being able to have more interactive AI NPCs will allow game designers who design to the idea of a living world where the interactions with anyone in the environment can have some meaning and some interest and some depth and some reason for the players to do that. That is an opportunity that has opened up. But just saying, hey, every game can now have 500 dudes you can talk to, like in, like in Fortnite, who cares? That's not what I'm there for. In Borderlands, maybe that'd be really cool if the designers made all those people as interesting as the characters I already want to see the cutscenes with and stuff. So it kind of depends on how it gets used.
All right, and then can you define sort of transmedia content and sort of what that means for the industry? Because there are now all sorts of things that are possible, and so if we really felt like it, we could both turn into like gorgeous 20-year-old female avatars like Tilly Norwood, and people have racked up millions of followers on Instagram, like literally just by changing themselves to something that looks like that. Um, and that's changed a lot of things in terms of the dynamics of the industry.
Yeah, so the sort of creator content, influencer content, Instagrammer content world is definitely like that's where things like the Taylor Norwoods of the world have gotten a little more traction. There's a lot of opportunities for creators in those space to do creative things, like you said, like transforming themselves into other characters and stuff like that. And I think Gen AI just makes that again more efficient, but you still need to be creative. And that's why someone who's funny, who's got an interesting perspective, who has a great story, who's got really interesting shtick that they do, like whether that's some kind of performance or investigative journalism or travel or things like that. Like they have a story to tell that people want to engage with, and Gen AI gives them opportunities to do new and creative things with that, whether it's creating a so-called synthfluencer character that is entirely a creation or altering themselves or things like that. Um, then uh, the issue then, but they have to have a good story to tell. Now, the other issue that crops up is authenticity, which is emotional, has to be brought by the humans. Factual accuracy for things like reportage becomes a big deal and something that needs to be dealt with in the world of Gen AI as it gets more and more realistic. And the for reportage and facts and truth telling versus propaganda, that's going to be a very deep issue that society is going to have to contend with, especially considering we live in a world where a governor of a a gubernatorial candidate of a U.S. state who's the current sitting government just dropped out of the race because of a propaganda video that is a bunch of bullshit that wasn't even made with Gen AI. So now you take that situation and you amplify it with the power of Gen AI and what that means for news gathering, reportage, investigative journalism, in-depth journalism, politics, and civil society. That's a much bigger deal, a big deal that needs to be dealt with that touches on a lot of issues that are outside of AI, but that tie into issues of safety and governance. Um, that's a huge issue. Like people making goofy alien characters that tell baby jokes as their YouTube and TikTok and Instagram characters, fine. That's going to work or it's not going to work at a commercial level. And it's just another tool that you can play with along with filters and CG and digital cameras and all these things that allow you to make inexpensive creator content so long as you've got an interesting story and or shtick that people want to engage with. It's the impact that it's going to have on news and propaganda that's going to be something where safety and governance is really going to be, and accountability is really going to become an issue.
And so if you dig into some of the metadata of, image and video outputs now, there are layers of watermarking for the images. The images are hashed with individually. And so there's some degree of traceability as to the originality of the content, but it's not necessarily at a level that most people are going to detect, and it's not something most people would generally dig into anyways. um and so I'm wondering, like, sort of how you're working with that in terms of GenVid and any of the content that you're producing. And so are you sort of implementing any of that? What kind of restrictions do you have in terms of sort of accepting content and then outputting content? And then how is that different from a lot of the other platforms?
For sure. So, in terms of GenVid's productions, we make entertainment, right? So and we're just going to be upfront with people. We told everyone the secret is Gen AI. We're not hiding it from anyone. We're not like we're going to be open about that sort of stuff. In terms of the GenVid production platform, um, we have options for people to use a wide variety of different models. So if you're really worried about training data clarity, you can go ahead and use something like Moon Valley. Um, but you can also use Google and Sora and Kling and whatever else. Um, we embed all of the prompts as metadata in the outputs. Now, someone could then go and strip those out, but our base policy is the prompts are metadata in the image output. And that's both for accountability and also, frankly, for production, where you're like, how did this get made? You can just go and look at the metadata instead of having to go delving through a bunch of histories. And so like I like our policy is transparency. We're using Gen AI for this and this. We're telling you where it is. We've, at least through the pipeline, there's metadata embedded that tells you what the prompts were. Someone else who's using the tool could then go and strip all that out on delivery. And I mean, honestly, a lot of the editing tools, that's all going to get stripped out on delivery anyway. But we believe in transparency.
No, that's really good. That's also very, very sophisticated, and you guys probably have hordes of descriptive metadata for all of the outputs, given the potential length of some of the prompts.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And that will continue to grow as the tool is developed in terms of both that repo and then also the tools to process it, because what we're looking at is for the tool is to be able to give people the best possible capabilities for making professional content in Gen AI. And so we are going to continue to refine it based on both user input and analysis of how people are using it, like where they're getting stuck and all this sort of stuff to make the interface better. And also, um, as we develop more content, doing analyses of what went into making that and continuing to provide more and more capabilities that make that more like improve prompt adherence, give you better consistency, but also allow you to be able to be more transparent if you want to.
Okay. And so in terms of productions that you're working on, like The Seeker, it seems like you've pushed it through like a number of different LLMs for various stages of the production, which has so part of that is standard practice. And then the additional gamification that you did for the visuals in the film, that's very, very unique, and it gives it a little bit more of a different emotional feel. And so, if you're comfortable and it's not confidential, like, would you be able to discuss, some of the techniques and sort of where you intend to take the next release of The Seeker?
For sure. So in terms of like what we're looking to do, and I don't want to get into anything that's too confidential, so give me a sec to frame it. The stuff I just mentioned about improving content production capabilities, like we're going to continue to work on that and to make the tool better and better for our all of our users, including ourselves. Um, in terms of our productions, we are an interactive company at heart. That's what we won our Emmy for. That's where our patents lie. And so um, we're looking at ways to take what we've done with the Seeker and with the GenVid studio grade production tool and push that into different kinds of interactive content. And some of that may be interactive narrative content, and some of that may be something more along the lines of, say, an interactive Gen AI game show. Um, but just looking at ways to push forward interactivity on top of and gamification on top of Gen AI, um, and particularly with cinematic or televisionomatic, which is not a word, but whatever, um, uh, imagery and narrative, and particularly branching narrative interaction, which is what is kind of our core expertise. And then also looking at like what other kinds of gameplay can we layer on top of that, that is responsive and reactive and creates new content paths for the players as they interact with our experiences and experimenting with like what of those are cool and fun and engaging and achievable with the current phase of the technology as we go through each phase.
There have been enormous, jumps in terms of progress with diffusion models and its effect on world models and reasoning and everything else. And that has gradually branched into sort of the computer vision aspects of robotics and their ability to process input. And so, how do you see that continuing to play out in the future?
For sure. So like right now we've done a lot of really interesting things with LLMs and diffusion models, and I think there's still a lot more to do, especially in terms of, like I've said already, prompt adherence, consistency, and so on. And that's being worked on both at the software level and also there's some interesting high memory density hardware architectures that are in development right now that I think are going to allow a lot of capability jumps in the near future in 2026 and 2027 on that side. In terms of world models, like a lot of that in work on world models as integrated with things like LLMs and diffusion models and all the things that we've been working with so far, and reasoning models being integrated with that as well. I think there's a lot of great possibilities there, and there's a few things. The stuff that they're doing at places like Google with world models, where there are worlds being generated on the fly based on a set of designer parameters and then user inputs, I think is super cool. There's a lot of possibilities there, both for emergent gaming, where the player's path through the world is evolutionary based on what they're doing and all of the parameters that the designer has set up for how that world manifests based on people pushing back against it. But also, world models are obviously a, I believe, an essential, going back to some papers I wrote a long time ago about um, embodied cognition, applying Piaget theory to AI development and so on with Ben Goertzel, and a lot of opportunity for world models to give AI a grounding and an embodiment in a virtual space that allows it to be able to understand and reason better about movement through space, which will be very useful for robotics, locomotion, um, and for mapping and pathfinding, but also to create grounding for reasoning for a physical world, or at least a simulated physical world, and I allow the AI to have a lot of training and inputs that can enable it to understand things like spatial proximity and develop spatial acuity and things like that. Um, so I think that there's a lot of opportunity there in that space, and a lot of people are working on and exploring that. It's something that um, I think can also, in terms of bringing together world model generation of worlds based on descriptors and building in descriptions of, let's say, physics and things like that, um, feeding into groundings for reasoning system to give them things to reason about, and also going beyond the LLM and general machine learning approach, the statistically rooted approach, and folding in things like the folks at Singularity Net, who are people I've known for 30 years and have worked with in varying capacities over that time, on and off throughout, with semantic networks and other mathematical methods for data transformation, and also things like genetic programming um, to create different kinds of um, data modeling for reasoning about and reasoning systems that integrate with what's being done with world models and the kind of reasoning models that you're seeing emerge out of LLMs, I think is an area of R&D that's really super exciting, and that has a lot of potential towards what people call AGI. Like everyone has a different definition of that. So whatever, but in terms of giving the AI a better understanding of a simulated physical space and what a lot of things that we say are asking for and are looking to do and are asking a virtual character or a robot to do in terms of moving around in the world with us, there's a lot of opportunity there. And then in terms of games, there's a lot of fun potential opportunities for, again, like emergent and reactive worlds that allow a player to move through them based on the world reacting specifically to what they're doing based on the drivers parameters. Um, and also like just being able to have better reasoning about what it means to move in a 3D world, which can also, um, through the correct R&D, enable the AI to have a more rounded understanding of, and therefore better prompt understanding and adherence of things like you're shooting a set. What does a camera operator or a DP think about when you're shooting a set, which is I'm taking a three space and transforming it into two space through this camera. I understand how lighting works and stuff like that. They're not just generating pixels based on a statistical model of previous two-dimensional planes. And I think there's also a lot of interesting opportunities in world models to deepen the AI's understanding of filmic language, animation language, game design language, and so on, and having it be a better tool, a more understanding, adherent, and consistent tool for human creators to create awesome new worlds and experiences.
That is downright incredible, and that's a very, very high level of AI modeling. Um, and so thank you for that. One last question.
Of course.
So the CEO of DeepMind has spoken about the potential to generate an entire game purely from AI. And so do you think that AI can produce something worthy of winning an Academy Award by 2029? And do you also think that the AI can produce a game of said caliber by 2029?
So I I don't think that AI by itself, meaning you just sit down at your LLM, you go to Gemini or uh, ChatGPT or whatever, and say, I would like a heartwarming film about a orphan who, like finally finds the true meaning of Christmas, whatever. It was a terrible pitch, but whatever, right? Um, and then be like, go make that for me. And then, 7 hours later, all of your agentic tools are doing their thing. 7 hours later, you're like, Academy Award-winning film. Similarly, I don't think that you're going to go up to an AI in the next 2 or 3 years or to release by 2029 and say, hey, AI, uh, give me Fortnite, but everyone's made of cheese. And it's going to make you a game that is as playable, as deep, as fun, and engaging as Fortnite by just you saying that and then sitting back and drinking coffee while the agents go and do their thing. Uh, but do I think that AI tools will enable creative people to be able to do award-winning work in ways that are different than we've ever seen before, and also to take things that we have seen before and make it possible for independent teams to do them at a cost while still being competitive in terms of using their human ingenuity, experience, and talents to make something that's engaging, fun, interesting, compelling to an audience? Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Thank you.
Absolutely.